Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization, and I think hip thrusts are overrated. Oh boy, controversy. All right, we got hip thrusts for the gym lusts. Yeah, that actually makes a little sense. Let's talk about some upsides and downsides of hip thrusts, because as always, we get these thumbnails to catch you guys in here and these catchy titles and this controversial start, but as always, we want a measured, even-keeled, logical analysis. And every single bad thing has good things associated with it, or almost anyway. And every single good thing, almost every single good thing, has some bad things. So let's actually talk about the upsides first of hip thrusts, because they do have upsides. First, hip thrusts are a direct isolation exercise for the glutes. And there are just not that many direct isolation exercises for the glutes. Sumo squats and deadlifts, lunges of various kinds, step-ups, etc. They're all quad and adductor and glute and some lower back and some other stuff. So it's nice to have hip thrusts around to just check that box of like, bro, just glutes. It's cool. It's a good thing, right? If you have like dips are really effective for triceps, close grip benches are really effective, it's still nice to have some fucking cable pushdowns because it's just triceps. There's something to that. It's a good tool to have in the toolbox. Point number 2, upside for glute thrusts, is some people get really good results from them. People have done a bunch of different stuff, and so many of these stories, if you know who Brett Contreras is, he has tons of these stories to tell, and they're real stories, real people who like did all kinds of stuff, did lunged and squatted to the moon. Nothing really happened with their glutes. They got some gains, but it was unimpressive. They started adding in hip thrusts, and magic happened. At least over several weeks and months, they got notably bigger glutes. So for some people, hip thrusts absolutely work great. And lastly, a big upside is that hip thrusts have an ability to help you develop a really good mind-muscle connection. Because of that peak contraction, I'm having sex in midair, by the way, underneath the table. Yeah? You guys like that? Yeah? Oh, yeah? Anyway, I'm going to stop because there's rules about this sort of thing. You guys probably don't want to see something that looks like this make sex noises. In any case, that peak contraction, and I'm doing it right now again, and that lowering on the way down, controlling with your glutes, it really lets you feel your glutes, because lunges, squats, and deadlifts and all the other great exercises for the glutes, you're like moving around and it's hard, but sometimes it's really tough to actually feel your glutes. And some people have an issue where they can't really connect with their glutes that well. And with hip thrusts, when they learn to connect with their glutes using hip thrusts, because it's a great exercise to teach that connection, they may be able to take that connection and apply it to other exercises, which are biomechanically and anatomically and physiologically better, cause more muscle growth, more robustly at hip thrusts, and then benefit more in those exercises because of essentially the learned skill of connecting to the glutes that they got from hip thrusts. So those are at least 3 good things about hip thrusts. But there are 2 things about hip thrusts that are not great. One of them is not great. The other one is kind of the death knell that really is the core of what I'm going to say in this video. First downside, hip thrusts are painfully annoying to set up. You may be lucky that your gym has a machine for hip thrusts or one of those hip thrust sled setup things. Even still, it could be annoying. But if you're doing hip thrusts with the old barbell and the pad and the bench behind you, sometimes you have to use so much weight because the glutes are real strong in that position. Or even if you don't use a ton of weight, you got to slap the plates on, you got to slap more of it in, you got to warm up, you got to roll the bar off you got to roll the bar back on. And when the set is done and you've done hip thrusts with, 5 sets of 10 with 405, you're like, oh god damn it, I got to drag 4 plates off this thing. It's like a deadlift. It's so fucking annoying. You can't take the weights, put them on, take them off. It's a thing. That's a downside for sure, but it's not the biggest one. The biggest one is that the hip thrust accentuates the load on the glutes at the very top in their peak contracted state when you're hip thrusting through. And then as you lower, biomechanically, there's less and less and less, exponentially less load placed on the glutes, such that at the very bottom of the hip thrust, where you're basically producing almost no force, that bottom stretch is actually the most muscle growth promoting point of any movement. So if you have the most load at the bottom stretch, you're growing a ton of muscle. If you have the same roughly amount of load at the bottom stretch, you're growing a very decent amount of muscle. If you have the lowest load of the movement at the bottom, the movement is now inferior for muscle growth compared to the other two. So for example, if you are doing skull crushers, at the very top of the skull crusher, this is easy because the vector relation to gravity is super tiny, and thus you could skull crush like 1 trillion pounds from here to here, but you only need, you're skull crushing 65. So this is the easy part. The lockout's super easy with skull crushers. The biomechanics are such that the vector is the most forceful right here at the bottom where your triceps are the most stretched. So the skull crusher biomechanically, that's a gnarly exercise. It's that first kind of exercise where the bottom stretch is also the mechanically most difficult part. That makes the skull crusher a fucking great exercise. Then you have a situation where you have another exercise that is maybe in the middle range, the hardest, a bicep curl. Easy down here, easy up here. In the middle, it's really hard. Not the worst thing in the world, but not the best. A great exercise, but ideally it would be hardest at the bottom, easiest at the top. And then you have the hip thrust, which at the bottom is essentially imperceptibly difficult, precisely where you want to be the hardest. And at the top, it's the hardest. So if you want to actually go through a full range of motion and get that peak contraction, which is where all the other benefits of the hip thrust occur, the glutes engage, you get the mind-muscle connection, it's directly isolation of the glutes. That hip thrust all the way through at the top, you have to use such a little amount of weight at the top that the bottom is even less challenging. And there's not really an amount of weight you can use that makes the bottom challenging anyway. It would be like a gargantuan amount of weight because the leveragers are so in your favor that you're essentially, there's almost no way to take a hip thrust with a normal conventional load and challenge it at the bottom stretch. And that's a problem. And it is evident that when you do hip thrusts, you may be able to do 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 sets of hip thrusts and get a little bit twinge of soreness, especially if you've done them before. But you do 2 sets of front foot elevated lunges, which stretch your glute like crazy at the bottom when the force is the highest. You will get sore for 5 days in your glutes. And guys, this is not just by accident. This means you are growing more from any one given set of lunges versus hip thrusts. Now, there is a way to solve that problem. You just do more hip thrusts. 10 sets of hip thrusts every 3 sets of lunges. You'll get the same hypertrophy from one and the other. But fuck me, let's say I'm exaggerating. Call it 6 sets for every hip thrust versus 3 sets for every lunge. Call it 4 sets of hip thrusts for 3 sets of every lunge. Lunges are super easy to set up in almost every case compared to hip thrusts. You're already losing big time on opportunity cost. You have to ask yourself the question when you're picking a glute exercise of like, okay, do I want to do lunges, which I can do less of total sets and the setup is easier and the glute stimulus is bigger? Or do I want to do hip thrusts where it's annoying setup, it's going to take me more time, the exercise isn't even as effective, and I got to do more sets to compensate? The hip thrusts are starting to look pretty bad, right? Let me tell you guys about the RP Hypertrophy app. With over 28 preset programs already in the app, you can choose to make your own, you can modify an existing program, or you can just run the programs exactly as they were written by me personally. This app programs everything for you. Exercises, weights, sets, reps, frequency, the whole thing. After every single workout on every single week, the app adjusts to your unique parameters with every single input. We have over 250 exercises in the app with detailed video tutorial links to every single one. You never have to be confused about technique or form ever again. I'm guessing right now you're pretty interested in the app? Download the RP Hypertrophy app today. So the research on how much the stretch load, the loaded stretch matters, is starting to pile up now to be like, it matters. And exercises that really stretch you under load, like a super deep push-up or cambered bar bench press or dumbbell press, are just straight up superior for hypertrophy on a set per set equated basis than exercises that don't cause that stretch. Now, of course, you could do more sets, but that's more fatigue, that's more time. And it looks like hip thrusts just are overrated as the first go-to glute exercise because compared to lunges, because compared to sumo deficit deadlifts and sumo squats, etc., and a few other glute exercises, they just suffer from that big force curve problem. So here's my take. Yes, Definitely try hip thrusts, glute bridges, same thing as far as I can tell. But if the results are underwhelming, do not be shocked. Try lunges, walking lunges with barbells, dumbbells, reverse lunges, and especially front foot elevated lunges on a Smith machine where your front foot is like 2 or 3 or 4 inches above the ground, your back foot's on the ground, because that front glute, the one that's being stretched, that front foot's glute, that's the one that's being stimulated. If you elevate your foot and still come down with the other leg to where your knee touches the ground gently, you're going to stretch the living dog shit out of that glute that you're hitting. Switch legs after a bit of rest, hit it again. That is such a great exercise. It should almost always be first in line before hip thrusts if you're really serious about hypertrophying your glutes. Now, lastly, in the future, maybe not too distant future, we'll have some machines that work on electric motors. And then you can adjust the force curve as you see fit. For those machines, if you get some kind of bar across your hips and there's 2 cables to electric motors, you'll be able to adjust it such that at the very top, there's very little force applied by the electric motors. But as you glute bridge and hip thrust back down, the force increases radically such that you still get a crazy stretch at the bottom, like, holy shit. And then as you push up, it gets easier and easier. If we can get the hip thrust motion to be a bigger tension at the bottom and a smaller tension at the top, damn, dude, that's going to make hip thrusts really, really awesome exercise because, first of all, electric motors, you don't have to pile weights on the bar. Second of all, quick setup, so it's not as annoying. And third of all, the force curve is going to match, and it's an isolation exercise, and it's great for mind-muscle connection because at the top, the load is very minimal. You really get to crunch your glutes and really feel them out. And then on the way down, they stretch like crazy. Man, that's going to be an amazing exercise. But with free weights, so far, hip thrusts in 2023, I think they're a bit overrated. Folks, that's all I have for today. See you next time.